Coming up on this week's show, the Office suite that runs on your Game Boy.
An amazing new Doom clone arrives on the Amiga.
And we get the ultimate history of video games with author Steve Kent.
The Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each week with our good mates at Bitmap Books. Now, if you're a fan of the Game Boy, you have to check out Game Boy, the Box Art Collection, a celebration of some of the best ever cover artwork for Nintendo's monochrome Marvel, which kickstarted the handheld games industry. At over 372 pages, it is a must-read for all Game Boy fans. You can check that out on all their other range of retro gaming books at bitmapbooks.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 292, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very, very warm welcome to this week's show. You know, last week we were saying we're into September now, you know, the nights are getting a bit longer. Autumn's finally arriving. We're right in the middle of a heat wave here in the UK. We're actually recording this.
I think it's like the last heat wave of the year, but yeah.
You well and truly jinxed it, Dan. Like, honestly, we've actually, I'm not afraid to say, the boys have been waiting for me for like the last hour and a half because I've been trying to get my daughter back to sleep because it's so hot. She's been crying. But it's all Dan's fault.
I was just talking about putting the heating on last time.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we are a bit sweaty. Hopefully no one's going to pass out as we get through the news stories over the next half an hour or so. But I mean, it is amazing doing this podcast. The fact that we're up to, episode number 292, getting ready for the big 300 that, don't want to tease it or jinx anything again, but I think we do have a rather special guest on the way for episode 300. Yeah, which is someone who's incredible.
We just need to make sure it happens now.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the thing. This podcast, when we started it nearly 6 years ago now, it was always an aim to kind of document this industry that we've just, throughout our lifetimes, how much gaming has grown. I mean, I was looking the other day that obviously with the pandemic, for some industries, entertainment in particular, in terms of, streaming services and games, it's actually been quite kind to it. The gaming industry grew massively last year. It's now worth $90 billion. That is a huge market.
It's crazy, and it's gone properly mainstream. Like, even this week, we got a press release from Selfridges, and they were saying that they were opening a gaming shop, and in their section of their gaming shop, they're going to have an Aston Martin simulator and a 24-karat gold arcade machine. So, if Selfridges are kind of investing in luxury gaming and stuff, it really shows, how it's kind of popping off. But also, in lockdown, people have really taken it up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, when we chat to people that have been involved in the industry for a long time, it really does show you how far it's come. I mean, in a relatively short time. We've spoke before that if we were doing a movies podcast, it wouldn't be possible to do this because, you couldn't go back to the people that, started the movie industry like over 100 years ago because, none of them are here anymore. But the fact that we've had Nolan Bushnell on the show and these pioneers that were there right at day one of the industry. And actually our guest today is an author who's actually written two very, very comprehensive books detailing the rise of this industry because, really our guest this week, Stephen Kent, he had a front row seat to a lot of this when it was actually happening.
Oh, man, this interview is absolutely amazing. He's talking about stuff like the PlayStation 2 launch, but all the launches of all the earlier systems as well, like the Jag and the kind of 16 and 8-bit launchers. He was receiving thousands of games a day as well and sitting there. And back in the days, basically doing the dream job of every teenager, which was receiving games and reviewing them in 1993, which is really amazing to hear his stories.
Yeah, well, he started working on the Seattle Times, which obviously, a very big newspaper back in the early 90s, as you mentioned. Worked for a load of big magazines in America, Next Gen magazine, Electronic Games, to name a few. And obviously, doing that job, he kind of, he schmoozed with all the big company execs. He interviewed Miyamoto and, he had access to guys like Howard Lincoln and Tom Kalinske. And, he was there at the time when, you remember then, that kind of pre-internet era especially, how important the printed media was, newspaper columns and magazines. And it was a really interesting time for him to cover gaming, that kind of transition from the 16-bit machines through 32-bit, the CD-ROM era, full motion video coming in. He was actually there at the launch of the PlayStation 2 in Japan. He had like a front row seat checking it out. He was one of the only people that didn't actually pre-order it that actually got a PlayStation 2 in Japan on launch day. So he's got some incredible stories. But also, as you mentioned, Ravi, he's written 2 very comprehensive books. The first one that came out in 2001, called The Ultimate History of Video Games, that actually is now followed up. Volume 2 came out last month. So this is like, books that are like 20 years in the making. That is how comprehensive these are. So I guess Stephen Kent, he's coming up. You're going to really enjoy this week's interview. Some real behind-the-scenes stories. And he's going to be on the show in around 25 minutes from now. Now let's get straight into the stories this week, because it has been a very busy week in terms of retro gaming and technology news. This is something that I never expected to see, particularly something getting funded on Kickstarter to this level. This is a Game Boy productivity suite. It's like an office suite for the Game Boy that's been fully funded on Kickstarter.
This is kind of like really interesting for me, because it was only a couple of months ago that wasn't there like a prototype of this officially made by Nintendo, like that emerged.
There was covered. Like a keyboard add-on.
Yeah, like a keyboard
and there was
add-on,
a prototype, and that kind of worked with some software that they had. But, this is something a lot more comprehensive, I think.
Yeah, a little bit more comprehensive than that. So, I mean, I've got visions of like Dan, working in the office, in the hustle bustle, pulling out his Game Boy, for his notepad or his calculator or his clock, for his diary on his Game Boy now.
Who needs my iPhone?
Who needs an iPhone when you've got a Game Boy? But yeah, this is went up 2 days ago at the point of recording, so it'll be about 5 days ago when the show comes out for Kickstarter for essentially free individual productivity suite cartridges for the Game Boy, which comes separately. So you've got the calculator cartridge, the notepad cartridge, and the clock cartridge, which essentially do what they say on the tin, which have all been made in correct me if I'm wrong, Ravi, they've been made in assembly for the Game Boy.
Yeah, so assembly's like the basic kind of...
Yeah.
Well, basic's another language. God, that's a bad way to explain it. Assembly is like the kind of low-level language.
Yeah.
So they run really fast, even though it's a calculator and you don't probably need it to run that fast. But Sam McDonald actually submitted this on our Discord, and I knew nothing about this, and just seeing it looks mad. So you're right, they've got all these different kind of ones, and... they've also got like some stretch goals, so you can have a to-do list as well, which is another one. And they're all on individual carts as well, which just looks absolutely mad. I think they're producing the carts themselves, so they're limited on the kind of amount that they can have.
They're going to producing it themselves. Their goal was $2,000, which they hit within a day. And at this point, they're around about $6,000-7,000 already. I think they've got a little way to go for the stretch, but they've still got 32 days to go, and they've got 150 backers already. But I've just got visions of like people genuinely trying to use it. Like you put your calculator cartridge in, you do your sums, and then you take the cartridge out and you put your notepad cartridge in, and you type something out on the Game Boy, which would take, I imagine, a very long time to actually type out using the D-pad and the B and A button.
Well, this is one of the lines. Gee, wouldn't it be sweet if you didn't have to worry about search engine people scraping your data, spying through your webcam? Well, this is for you. And Dan, do you think you'd use this? And it's kind of a bit pointless, isn't it? But it's a fun and novelty kind of thing.
You know what? I am dorky enough to actually use something like this. A couple of months ago, I was just trying to find something in my cupboard, and I came across my Apple Newton. That did a video on a couple of probably about 2 years ago. I did a video on it now, and actually I thought, I'm going to try using that for a bit. So I put some batteries in it, put it in my bag, took it to work, and actually used it as my notepad for like a day until it went back in the cupboard again. But I think there is something. It's weird because whenever I do my taxes every year, I always generally do it. I do it on my Amiga normally, just because it makes the process a bit more interesting than just doing it on Word or something, and also it lets you focus being offline. You know, the fact that I haven't got like tweets coming up and stuff like that. So I generally do all my taxes on like my Amiga 4000 in the text editor.
I think this year you should do your taxes on your Game Boy.
I've got a feeling that if I want to make my deadline for the taxes, the tax return, it might not be the best idea to do it on the Game Boy.
And you could print it out on that tiny paper and then submit it to the
I do have one of those,
man.
actually. I do have one of those.
That would be amazing. What I love, though, is how 90s the advertisement is for it as well. It's like, the notepad. Here are the features of it. Storage for up to 10 notes. Multiple eye-pleasing fonts. Switch easily between keyboard layouts. Optional password protection. Digital edition. The clock. Easy read to display. 12 to 24 hour mode. Definitively answer the question of what time is it?
Well, even back then, having features like, I've got a calendar or a calculator.
Yeah.
You'd show off if you had them on your watch or your PDA. Yeah. It's kind of like a bit bragging rights, wasn't it? Like you never use it.
And this is the thing, I can imagine in 1989 when the Game Boy came out, if they could get all three of them onto one cartridge with a battery save pack on it, I could see people would actually have used it back then.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I really do feel, especially if the keyboard had come out as well, I could imagine it being quite successful. But in 2021, like you say, it's just to be geeky and nerdy and quirky.
I do like the fact that they have got these stretch goals as well. I mean, one of them's called their Paperweight, but there's another one they're apparently working on an e-reader as well. So I imagine that's going to let you read like e-books on it, like use it as like a Kindle.
Oh my god,
which would be pretty cool.
Read the Bible on a Game Boy.
Connecting your Game Boy to Amazon Prime to download your books.
Emailing an author, I can't get it to work on my device. Why were you trying to read it on?
My Game Boy.
You know what, though? The fact that this has been already successfully funded, and a lot of the comments are kind of like you said, a bit tongue-in-cheek, like, where was this 30 years ago when I was at school? I could have used it. But I think there is just an appetite for something a little bit different like this and fun, which I think is really cool. So, yeah, I mean, if I saw something like this and it was cheap enough, I probably would pick it up just for the fun of using it once, I guess. So we'll keep an eye on that. If you want to back it on Kickstarter, it is available now, and I'll put it in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, this next article, I must admit, Ravi, I thought there was a typo in our show notes here. This is the Sega, not the Sega, the Sega Main Gear Drop-In. What's this?
This is mad. Like, I spotted this online, and I'd never seen it. It's quite an old device, actually. It's been out for a while. But what it is it's an exact drop-in. So basically, it's a main board that's powered by the Raspberry Pi. So you can have a Raspberry Pi 3A Plus or a Pi Zero in there. And you can basically drop the board into Game Gear. And it has a little nice LCD screen on there. It's got the contact pads and everything, so they fully connect with the D-pad. And you use all the plastics that are inside, and you collect your Raspberry Pi at the end. It's even got the charging thing. It's basically everything you need, but also it's got a full custom recreation of the Game Gear shell. So you don't have to use an old Game Gear and rip it apart.
That was going to be my next question. Can you put it in a Game Gear, or can you buy a shell for it?
Yeah, there's a thing called the Retro 6 reproduction shell.
Okay.
And you can basically get that, and they sell the full kit for £250.
Okay.
And that's like the full kit with the rechargeable lithium batteries in, so it's going to last a lot longer. It's got a speaker in there. Raspberry Pi is included in that. 3.2 LCD display. But also they're working on the Sega Mega Gear 2 as well, which is going to be the improved version, which is actually going to have HDMI output as well.
Oh,
so
wow.
You can play it like a Switch, on your television as well. And you won't be attached to the wall like old school style Game Gears.
I do like this because, I mean, the fact that you can drop it into an original Game Gear shell, if you've got like a broken one, for example, lying around, I mean, I can't imagine many people with Game Gears are going to actually butcher them to put something like this in there. But if you've got one that's maybe on its last legs, like mine, needs recapping and everything, I could just, because, I mean, you don't have to get rid of your original Game Gear. You could just take out the internals and put this in and, keep the internals of your Game Gear safe somewhere else, I guess. But it looks like you couldn't tell by looking at this, apart from the fact it's got a much nicer screen, that you've actually done anything to the Game Gear, I guess.
Yeah, it could be like that Muck Will mods kind of been put in there, but also you have all the Pi options in there. So, you know, you'll have RetroPie. You could probably play the original Game Gear games on ROMs, load them in with USB on the second one, but also, you know, you have them on the SD card on there, and you can just fire away, play Atari Lynx on there, you know, Game Boy stuff, PlayStation
and anything that works with the Raspberry Pi 3A,
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. So, you know, you can MAME and everything on there as well. They do actually say there's an image available for download with all the software installed and ready to go as well. So, by the sounds of it, it's just a case of, you know, drop your ROMs in and play. So, I do think that's very cool.
And like you say, a lot of Game Gears do need recapping. You know, 99% of the time when I see Game Gears for sale, they are usually faulty. Like, it's just one of those consoles you find just, you know, seem to have died over the last 30 years. So I can see this being quite popular. Like you say, with people, you know, oh, my Game Gear's on its last legs or whatever. I just can't seem to fix the screen, etc. You know, whatever is wrong with it, you know, pop one of these in there, you know, and they're 35 quid as well. It looks, you know, I'm an idiot, like, when it comes to, like, soldering and stuff like that. But with it being pre-made like this, it does look pretty like, you know, this cable goes here, this button goes here, pop it together, and you know, Bob's your uncle, off you go, kind of thing. So it's pretty cool.
And especially when you look at stuff like, you know, if you've got your original Game Gear, I know this is emulation, but I mean, there's a fine line between real hardware and emulation when it comes to stuff like this, in my mind, because if you wanted your Game Gear, so you want a replacement screen in there, you want a new modern battery solution, you want to get it recapped, you're talking probably, you know, over 100 and 150 pounds, maybe even more than that.
Yeah.
But something like this, you're still playing on the original D-pad, you're still playing on the original buttons. So the experience is not going to be too much different, even though, you know, deep down, you know, there's an emulator in there, I guess.
The question is, does it go Sega when it starts up?
That'd be pretty cool.
If not, then it should. There you go. Have that idea on us. But yeah, that does it very good. I must admit, I'm looking at that thinking, because my Game Gear, I've had it for about probably 5 years now, and it needs recapping. And I've got a guy who does all my recapping. You know, he's doing my Amigas and everything. I told him I need a Game Gear, and he went, "Oh, really?" He was, "I hate doing the Game Gear."
That's when you know
He
it's
said,
a
"I'm really
hard
good
one
with
to do.
So, yeah, this does look great. Nice little drop-in replacement if you've got a Game Gear that's on its last legs. Now, something else that I've been seeing everywhere this week, and I must admit, this is something that we talked about a few months ago, but actually seeing this up and running, videos of this, and now you can actually download it too. This is jaw-dropping. Now, this is a Doom clone that runs on the lowest end Amiga 500 and is actually a pretty playable first-person shooter.
Yeah, the crazy thing is this is like full screen and it runs smoothly, which is absolutely mental because, you know, we've seen the development videos on YouTube. If you check them out, there's a developer called KK, and he's an absolute genius. And also the guys who did that, remember that Street Fighter demo where they talked about the Amiga having Street Fighter and how it could have been done much better? They're involved as well. Pixel Glass, I think that's what they're called. It's just absolutely blooming amazing, this is, because I don't know if you remember, Dan, but most Amiga first-person shooters used to be in a little stamp size, you know, and they wouldn't even run fast in that tiny stamp.
Yeah, well, I remember, you know, being a kid who had an Amiga, then Doom coming along, and, you know, to run Doom, I'd say comfortably, I wouldn't play Doom on anything less than a 486.
Yeah.
Really, you know, it's kind of the I know you can play it on a 386, but not smoothly. But I think I often see people on Facebook groups and that going, why do you want to play Doom on the Amiga? It was a PC game, and in many ways, it was a game that kind of put the final nail in the Amiga's coffin. But I think there was always a big Doom envy of the Amiga community, which is probably the reason why so many people, like, you know, try and get games like this running on it. Because I remember there is actually quite a famous email that you can still read if you go onto Usenet, and you know, there are websites, history websites that have archived it, when a guy who was an Amiga fan emailed John Carmack from id Software and said, you know, are you going to port Doom to the Amiga? And he said, even the highest end Amigas couldn't run Doom. It's not possible. So I think it's kind of been a bit of a, you know, for the last 30 years, Amiga fans have just been trying to prove him wrong.
Yeah, and this is actually done with Doom Builder. So they've used all the kind of free Doom assets, but they've cleaned them up and they've optimized them graphically for the Amiga as well. And they're using all the kind of new routines and everything to make it amazingly fast. So it looks very pretty. And, you know, this is one of those kind of time machine games that if you went back in the past, you would probably sell a lot of systems, you know.
And the name of the game is Dread, just so our listeners know, because nobody said it.
yeah, sorry. And also there's an Atari ST version.
Yeah.
So they've taken the Amiga code and they've released an ST version as well. Obviously,
which is arguably even more impressive, actually, because the ST didn't have custom chips and stuff.
Yeah,
either.
so it's a bit slower, but it's still blooming impressive in its own right. If someone released that for the ST, you know.
The first thing I did when I saw this was I've been playing loads of Doom recently, like played through Doom 1 and 2, and then I've been playing through the Quake remaster recently, so obviously I wanted to see how it ran, and it runs really smooth, you know, from the demos and stuff from what I'm watching. It looks a little bit muddy, like I will admit, like, you know, when it's playing, but it's pretty, even though it's muddy, it's clear, do you know what I mean? There's no kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, there's no...
the blurriness.
Yeah, it doesn't blur or anything like that, and it does run really nice. Like I was expecting, you know, the screen to be really jittery, like as you went left to right and stuff like that, but it isn't like that at all. You know, like Ravi said, if there was a time machine or whatever, if they had this back in, you know, 93 or whatever, I think, you know, Doom might not have been, you know, the final nail in the coffin for the Amiga.
Well, also, like, you know, the graphics are designed to also appear on a CRT as well. So like a lot of people are playing them on emulators and stuff like that and on the YouTube videos. But apparently I've heard on a CRT, it looks absolutely stunning. And you can follow the development on YouTube if you look on KK Altair, his channel. They're kind of going through every asset and they'll show you like, oh, this is the wall and this is what we decided to improve on it. And these are the 4 versions and this is the enemy animation. And it's amazing seeing development like that kind of clear on YouTube where everybody can see it and kind of watch the progress and get excited.
But yeah, I mean, stuff like this is just a complete technical marvel. The fact that, you know, that is running on the original Amiga chipset from 1985. You know, on a machine with like 1 megabyte that was, you know, in terms of game power, less than a Mega Drive. That's, jaw-droppingly impressive. So look forward to checking out the full game. If you want to check that out, of course, I'll link that up in our show notes too. Now, so this is some exciting Sega news. A game that had a really interesting visual art style back in the day. And I enjoyed this game, Jet Set Radio. Now, there is some news that the guy behind the artwork on that game, that, you know, very distinctive, is now back at Sega.
Yeah, so this is absolutely fantastic. It's, I'm going to say this so wrong, Ryute Uda.
Yeah, I thought I'd let you pronounce his name.
You did better than I would have done.
he was like the art director for Jet Set Radio Future and Jet Set Radio. And man, like the style, I remember when Jet Set Radio came out, it was like a graffiti game where you could kind of skateboard and go around the world, but it had this animation vibe on it and it was just fantastic. It reminded me a lot of Prappa the Rapper.
Yeah.
Kind of like the 3D stuff, and it was all pop culture-y, and it was like that Japanese kind of really cool vibe, you know.
The graphics of Jet Set Radio, you know, I remember seeing it everywhere when it came out on the Dreamcast and stuff. That was like what the future looked like to me. That was like, it looked like a full-on animation cartoon. You know, like the jump from like seeing PS1 to suddenly seeing that. Like, don't get me wrong, the Dreamcast had some pretty impressive looking games, but I remember I've never played the Jet Set Radio games, to be perfectly honest, but I've seen them and they do look like beautiful. And I think it's down to the art style. I think the art style hides a lot of the graphical limitations, if that makes sense.
It's like Breath of the Wild kind of has a little bit of that kind of vibe, but this like reeked cool. So it had like, you know, the Beastie Boys were involved with it, Public Enemy, and you know, it was like, I think at one point there was a big controversy over it because you were going around graffitiing stuff, and this was for like, you know, a console, and they were like, oh, is this got to have a higher rating and stuff like that. It was setting this futuristic Neo Tokyo place. Really cool game.
Yeah. Well, he's not just famous for working on Jet Set Radio. He also was the director of the Yakuza games while he was with Sega up to 2012. Now, I know the Yakuza games have been really big recently, and there's a hell of a lot of them for like 360 and Xbox One and, PS3 and PS4. And he's not been with Sega since 2012. But once again, they're very stylistic, artsy games. Like, I don't know if you guys have played them or seen them, but
I've seen them, but I've never like gone into the Yakuza series.
Yeah, but they're really, really arty looking games as well. So it's cool to have him back. I wonder if another Jet Set Radio game is on the horizon, or if he's just going to get involved with the Yakuza series, which is really big at the moment. But interestingly, the last game he worked on for Sega is one of your favourites, Dan, which is Sonic All-Stars Racing Transformed.
Yeah, fantastic game.
Yeah.
And again, that's another game with a really great visual art style.
Yeah, it really is, yeah.
What I find interesting is that he's been working apparently at Yahoo on mobile titles, and I didn't even know Yahoo did mobile games or anything.
I don't know who owns Yahoo or if it's still around, what's going on there.
I know Yahoo's really big in Japan. So
right.
The Yahoo auctions, isn't it?
Yahoo auctions and stuff like that. So I imagine, they've still got Yahoo games on like, the Japanese App Store and stuff like that. So it's cool to see him going back to kind of like where his roots are and get him away from mobile games.
Ask Jeeves Gaming.
Yeah.
See, I mean, this could be a good sign that they're doing except they did do like a remaster of Jet Set Radio on the PS3.
Yeah.
I remember probably about a decade ago now.
Yeah.
And maybe 360, I think it was on as well. So maybe, it's a sign that they're going to be doing another updated version of it. But I think, it's just having these old school Sega developers, especially from that era, they all had their own kind of very strong style. I mean, that game all seemed very cyberpunk.
Do you remember, I think it was called Space Station 5 or
Yeah, I remember
that was a Dreamcast game, yeah.
Yeah.
Shoot.
That was the
Wasn't
same
Michael
style,
Jackson in that game?
As a like unlockable character.
I'm sure he was, yeah.
Was he?
Yeah.
I played that probably, about 7-8 years ago, maybe. Yeah, and that, again, just a very weird game, and the kind of thing that you probably only see from Sega.
Yeah,
that whenever you like refill at home. Oh, you're right. Yeah, actually, apparently there's Michael Jackson had a cameo appearance in the game. You're right.
There you go.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
You learn something new every day.
Because that was very much, it had it looked a bit like a 50s kind of art style, didn't it? But brought into the future, if that makes sense, all the hairdos and stuff that they had.
Yeah.
Was,
What the
very
future
unique.
like that weird Sega future.
The Jetsons. Yeah. So, it is cool that, bringing back, especially people from that era that had so much creativity, these kind of OG Sega artists back to the fold again is very exciting, I think. So, look forward to seeing what comes of that. Now, what about this? And while we're talking, obviously, about the Office Suite, this coming out for the Game Boy a bit earlier. What about if you haven't got a Game Boy lying around and you want something on your Nintendo Entertainment System? Google Maps on the NES is apparently reality. Now, we did talk about this before when it was an April Fool's, I remember.
So I made a bit of a snafu earlier on. Ravi sent this over. Ravi did the news today. Thank you very much, Ravi. And I was reading this and I started watching it, and as Dan said, in 2012, Google did this as an April Fool's joke. Google Maps now available on the NES, and I skimmed over the article and started watching the Google Maps press release one, the April Fool's, and I was like, this is amazing. Like, why is this so like, oh my god, like, how has he done this? The production of it, even the production value of the YouTube video. And then I was like, wait a second, after about 3 minutes. But long story short, 2012 they did an April Fool's joke of Google Maps now being available on the NES, and it essentially played like Zelda or like Dragon Quest, where you kind of like, it had like a world map and you put, what you wanted, where you wanted to go, and then Google Maps would plan your route for you, and your little character would actually walk the route on the NES.
And it had speech recognition, didn't it, their demo?
That's when I realised something was up, when they did the speech recognition, because obviously the Famicom controllers had the microphones on them. So that's when I knew something was amiss and I was watching the wrong video. But the actual one that's been developed isn't far from it, is it, Ravi?
No, this is mad. I'm going to try and work this one out, but it's by a guy called CC++, who's actually ported Google Maps the application to the NES, which is absolutely mental. And the way that he's done it is he's used a Raspberry Pi attached to a cartridge. I don't know if this is cheating or if cartridges had this mode. Maybe it's a bit more technical, but it's called PPU, which is a picture processing unit. And basically the Raspberry Pi attached to the NES acts as a cartridge, and the little Raspberry Pi is the actual PPU graphic accelerator. So you do need a little bit of graphics acceleration. And you know that port that came out of Doom that came out on the NES, that used this same one with the Raspberry Pi. But what this guy's done is absolutely mad. Like he splits the whole Google Maps into a grid of little like 8-bit squares, and then basically chose a texture, like a Zelda-like texture.
I was going to say, I read it was actually assets from the original Zelda NES game that he's used for the tiles.
It does look like it.
Yeah.
So he's actually used Google Maps.
Yeah.
Replaced the tiles with the Zelda ones, and then put it through this unit, and you can like zoom in on cities, and it will actually reveal it like Google Maps. But he says he's going to add some functions in the future as well. So it's going to be like the search function in there. So you'll be able to actually search for your town or city and maybe see it live on well, not live, but you'll be able to see it on your NES.
Is that a little 8-bit version of Ravi waving?
A little Zelda running around.
Street View, yeah. Yeah, I do think it's awesome, though, because obviously when that kind of Google, April Fool's mock-up video they put on there, at the time I looked at that and I thought, well, obviously the NES is not internet connected, so they can't exactly put all of Google Maps onto a cartridge. But obviously having this, the fact the Raspberry Pi's in there, I imagine connects to Wi-Fi to actual Google Maps and their APIs, and then can pull all this into it. So it's a good way of doing it, actually, and, very creative, I think.
Yeah, and he's aiming to fit it all on one cartridge eventually. So it will be on one cartridge, and it won't be using this all separate out Raspberry Pi and a cartridge adapter and all of this kind of stuff. And then also have a search by place name as well and clean it up. And he's going to open source it as well. So hopefully a lot of people will get onto this project, this crazy project, and there'll be a Google Maps for the NES.
I just have these visions of Ravi in his car getting lost somewhere, then opening the boot, getting the car battery out, big CRT monitor and his NES, put the cartridge in.
You just need to port the Game Boy port. That's what I'm waiting for.
And then he's going to pull out his Game Boy. Yeah, I was going to say he's going to pull out his Game Boy and use his notepad on his Game Boy to find the address of where he was going.
There's a YouTube video series, Ravi. I know you're back on YouTube again.
Yeah.
There you go. There's an idea for you. So, again, like everything else, like the other story we talked about, absolutely pointless, but extremely cool. So if you want to check that out, we'll put that. And all our stories, we put them in our show notes. You can check them out on your podcast app or just visit our website at theretrohour.com. All the links are in there for you. Now, before we get into our interview this week, talking about some classic moments in gaming, the ultimate history of video games with our guest Steve Kent, let's give a big thank you to our latest sponsor. And this is a company that I think everyone who's into retro gaming has a lot of respect for and are big fans of. This is our amazing friends at Monster Joysticks, who've been kind enough to support the podcast this week. Now, monsterjoysticks.com, they offer a wide range of quality arcade joysticks. And, all of us guys, we've got our background in the arcades. We all love going to arcades when we were kids. Even today, we go to stuff like Arcade Club and Play Expo. You can always find us in the arcades. There is nothing better than playing classic games on a quality arcade stick.
Oh, yeah. I absolutely love my Monster joystick. Like, it came in kit form, and I put it all together, and it was just so good for my Amiga CD32. I've used other pads. I've used joysticks before, and they just don't have the same kind of feel as having those genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And also it has a little switch on the back, so you can actually change it from up to jump to a button, which is really useful for some Amiga games.
Now, this is Monster Joysticks, who offer a really wide range of quality arcade joysticks, and they do actually two kind of different SKUs of these. They do retro gaming joystick kits, like the one you mentioned there, which work with your classic computers, stuff like, the Amiga, the Atari ST, Commodore 64, the Spectrum. They do versions for consoles as well, like the Mega Drive CD32 and the PC Engine. But also they do these amazing, and I've got one of these, an all-in-one 9-button Raspberry Pi arcade stick. So again, like the one you mentioned then, you can get this in kit form. And I built this myself, put my Raspberry Pi inside it. So actually the Raspberry Pi lives inside the joystick. So, from looking at it, it just looks like a quality 9-button arcade joystick. You turn it round, the Raspberry Pi's in there. You can pop an SD card in, HDMI cable, and you've really got a portable main machine. And you're playing these games with an actual quality arcade joystick. Because we've all done that before. You're probably the same, Joe. You've downloaded old school arcade titles and stuff like Xbox Live and that, and trying to play them with a modern pad, it just doesn't feel right at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is really, really nice to play old school fighting games and beat 'em ups with real hardware.
Just that joystick click.
Yeah,
there's something about it that takes me back to being like 11 years old in the arcade.
Yeah. You've got to have the click to it. You have to.
And one thing I'll say about these, they do deluxe kits with the proper Sanwa arcade parts in there as well. That, they're made to survive the most extreme usage. And Joe, you've seen me losing at games like
I was literally about to say.
And mine survived every one of those, and it gives you really high precision as well. They also do more budget-friendly arcade part options too, and assembling it is so much fun. You just need a screwdriver, no soldering, anything like that, and you can check them out. And of course, you'll be supporting the podcast, so have a look at their range of quality arcade joysticks for Raspberry Pi, for your retro systems. You'll find them at monsterjoysticks.com, and a massive thank you to our friends at Monster Joysticks for their support of the Retro Hour podcast. Now, can we just take a moment to say a huge thank you to our patrons, who are the people, they are the lifeblood of this podcast, the people that allow us to record this show. We do it at home these days. It's now 9:30 at night. We're all here feeling a bit sweaty this evening, but it's cool that we haven't got to, get in our car and travel to a studio that we rent somewhere, or we haven't got to try to, do it where we used to out of hours, 5 o'clock in the morning so we can get some studio time. And the fact is, with COVID over the last year, the fact is this podcast wouldn't have continued without our patron support, who bought us the equipment that we record on, help us pay for all our hosting, our website costs, that kind of thing, and also just let us bring you these incredible guests each and every week. We can't thank our patrons enough.
They're like an amazing community. They've kept me sane, and having meetings, the patron meetups are just absolutely fantastic, seeing everyone on the screen and having a good chat. But also the After Hours podcast, which now, if you do become a patron, you will have a considerable amount of as well, because the more that we do, there's a big kind of back catalogue of After Hours podcasts, and those ones are like the kind of backstage of the Retro Hour. We just talk about the old school kind of memories that we have, some of the old school systems. We're going to be talking about the PlayStation next. I'm so excited about the PlayStation one. I think we're all going to have some really big memories of that one.
Yeah, the After Hours really is kind of like a lot of people message us, especially when we did our feedback form a couple of weeks ago. We want to hear more of your guys' opinions, not just on the news, segments and stuff like that, and the people you interview, but about the Mega Drive or the PlayStation, like Ravi says. But that is literally what the After Hours is, and we've been going through kind of like, our life in that year in gaming as well. And we've covered what have we covered now? 99 to 2002 so far?
Yeah, so we've got 2003 on the one after
next.
the PlayStation.
We need to figure out where the cutoff point is, though. Big debate there.
We might start going backwards then.
Yeah, maybe.
It is good though, because we talk about not only the news stories that were happening in the world of retro gaming and tech that year. We play some clips from news reports, read magazine articles out. We look at the games that were out. We talk about our lives as well, and often it can be slightly embarrassing talking about what we were doing at those times.
Well, Joe was younger, you were older, and I was crazy. So a good mix.
Sums it up, I think, really. Yeah. So, it is always a great laugh doing that show. And the thing is, you made a really good point there, Ravi, because some people ask, if I sign up as a patron now, can I just hear the latest one? I kind of listen back. You actually get access to the entire back catalogue, which is like 15 shows. I think,
basically you get access to an RSS feed, which sounds complex, but you can just add it to your podcast app, and then suddenly you get the ad-free version of the podcast, which also has the extra patron story in it, and you get all of the After Hours, and they just go boom, boom, boom on your app and load like that, and you can just play them straight away.
Yeah, and you normally get the normal podcast a couple of days early. Most weeks we get out on like a Tuesday or Wednesday to patrons. And you also get invited to, all patrons are welcome to this every month. We love to see you there, our monthly Patrons Hangout that we do on a Sunday night, once a month for a couple of hours. It is just a complete nostalgia geek fest, isn't it? It's so much fun.
Oh yeah, it's amazing. Like it does cost me a lot of money though, but I enjoy it. You know, seeing a lot of people's systems and stuff. I'm just like, oh god, I need to get that. Or they talk about a new adapter or a new kind of device, and also we had. I think last time we had someone who'd found a motherboard at the side of the road and had cleaned it up and got the system going, and then was asking people like what CPU they think it was and stuff. And it was like, it started to turn into like a detective game. It was really interesting.
It is amazing. It's kind of like a virtual users group, we call it. And actually now we're into September, and we have got another episode of the After Hours coming out in the next week or so. And there'll be another Patrons Hangout in the next couple of weeks. Dates for that all be now patrons. So it's a very good time to join right now. Support this podcast, get access to all that incredible stuff. And of course, for being a backer of the Retro Hour podcast, you will make your way into the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. And a massive thank you to our latest patrons, Simon Vokins,
Leanne Griffiths,
Dave Moore,
Anton Johansson,
and Tim Hugo,
who all made donations into our Patreon. We massively appreciate your support. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to do the same, you'll find it on our website at theretrohour.com. Right then, next, we're going to be talking to author, writer, journalist Stephen Kent, who's been covering the industry since the early 90s, recently followed up his book that came out 20 years ago, The Ultimate History of Video Games. He's got so many incredible stories. He had front seat access to all this stuff while it was happening. He's amazing. And he is our guest next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time for our favourite part of the show where we welcome on a very special guest. And this week we're joined by an author, writer and journalist who's been writing about the video games industry since the early 90s and recently followed up his 2001 book, The Ultimate History of Video Games. So let's welcome on our guest this week, Stephen Kent. Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Good. How are you doing today?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Really appreciate you joining us for a little bit of a reminisce, hopefully, and obviously to talk about your new book as well.
Thank you for the invitation.
No problem at all. Now, it's always interesting to kind of find out from our guests where your journey with video games began. I mean, do you remember what initially got you into gaming then? Did you discover it as a kid? What kind of happened there?
Well, first of all, I was into video games before there were video games. I loved going to arcades and even hotels. I remember going to a hotel in Lake Tahoe. It had to have been 68 or 69, and they had the pre-video games, the electromechanicals. Like I loved a game called Night Bomber, where you would see the sort of spinning, you were flying over a city, and you'd look down and you'd see sort of a spinning world with a city on it, spinning slowly, and targets that were slightly lit up. They used a lot of black lights back then. A famous one you might remember is Chicago Motor Speedway, where you had a little model of a race car in front of a screen with a cartoon of a raceway, and you had to try and dodge the cars in the cartoon on that little screen. And I liked those. And then in 1972, when I was in middle school, we went as a class to a place called Kalihi Bowling, or Kalihi Bowl. It was a bowling alley. And as we were walking there was of all things, a computer. There was this game, and it had a screen, and it had two lines and a square on it. And so the teacher sent everyone else to go bowling, and he and I stopped and played Pong. I don't remember who won, but by the time it was over, I was sold for life.
And you didn't have to wear those awful shoes as well as bowling shoes.
That's true. And you never know what's growing inside those awful shoes.
Well, I was wondering, were you into writing as a kid, and were there any books that were really influential for you?
There were books. I'm mildly dyslexic, which drives my poor editors crazy. I can be horrific to try and edit, but I'm mildly dyslexic, so reading is a slow process for me. There were a lot of books that I liked as a kid, and more when I got older. I got very much into the James Bonds for a while. I loved Ian Fleming. Casino Royale, I still consider a seminal novel in my life.
It's tough as well because I'm dyslexic and I write for a magazine as well. So when they get the proofs and stuff, they're like, "Oh my god!" But you've just got to try and get your imagination to kind of flow on the paper.
You do. It's a tough thing, and yeah.
I understand you were kind of a games mag reader, so maybe those were easier for you.
Well, remember again. So we're talking 72. The games didn't exist yet. I mean, if you wanted to read about video games in a magazine back then, maybe a Futurist in Playboy or by 77, Omni magazine might have an article a year about it. You know, Arnie Katz and Bill Kunkel and Joyce Worley, really I consider the pioneers of video game journalism, along with Andy Eddy, at least in the United States. Let's be fair about that. Joyce Katz, Kunkel, and Worley had Electronic Games Magazine out. That's not to be confused with Electronic Games Monthly, EGM, which came out later and, of course, outlasted it. But it catered better to a younger crowd. But Katz, Kunkel, and Worley had a lot of impact on me, both reading them first before I got to join them. And then I was working in a small PR firm. I had written my first 3 articles for the Seattle Times, or my first 2 articles for the Seattle Times on video games. And Joyce Katz happened to call in to ask about a product we had. We had an interactive Gary Larson Far Side calendar we were representing. And she called in to get a copy of that. And I pitched her on letting me write for her magazine. And she said, sure. So I got to write a review for them. And that was sort of the turning point for me.
Well, how did you get that column in the Seattle Times then?
Oh, that's a fun story. I was, when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, which is in journalism, it was in the mid-'80s when there were 2 kinds of people in the world: the people who read Stephen King novels when they first came out, and the people who waited and let them get ruined by hearing the people who read them first. And I was just poor enough that I couldn't afford to buy the books when they came out. We're talking the era of It and Misery and Eye of the Dragon. I couldn't afford them, so I called the Seattle Times and talked to the book editor and convinced him that I knew more about horror than he did, and asked if I could do his horror book reviews, which meant that I now got Stephen King books before other people. I got to be the master ruiner of the books for everyone in Seattle. And I think I got paid $25 for each book that I read on top of it. That was pretty amazing. That was in 85, 86. Then I went off in 88 to get my master's degree in public relations. And when I came back to Seattle in 93, I called up and asked if I could do a review of virtual haunted houses for Halloween. Mostly because there was a game out called The Seventh Guest. Yeah. I couldn't afford to buy it again. And also you needed a CD-ROM player to play, or a CD-ROM drive in your computer to play it. I didn't have one of those. My computer is pretty old. But my wife let me put a CD-ROM drive in because I got them to say, yes, I could write a review of virtual haunted houses. So I reviewed The Seventh Guest, which I liked. I didn't love. It was a great demonstration of technology, but I also got to review Alone in the Dark on CD-ROM. And Alone in the Dark, that was amazing.
That was a great time to kind of be entering it, 1993. You know, it must have been amazing with that whole kind of CD-ROM coming in there, and also kind of switch between 16 to 32-bit generations.
Well, yeah. So in 93, the SNES was actually still pretty new. Sega had released, I believe, had already released its Sega CD-ROM drive, the Sega CD. Every game that was coming out was, they wanted to be quote unquote interactive movies. It was the day of interactive movies. And you'd see these games with awful CD video clips. The resolution was terrible, but I'll be darned, you know, it was video and you got to quasi control it, and everyone thought that was amazing. So there was Mad Dog McCree and just a host of games that, you know, through, like I say, really bad video clips at you.
I remember the acting was terrible in them, but it was just jaw-dropping to see actual video in a game, wasn't it?
Absolutely. That's exactly it. Then the acting was horrific. Yeah.
Well, how many games were you receiving and covering then, like on a weekly basis then? You must have been sent loads in the mail, I imagine.
Yeah. So, when I started out, so I did that. I got 3 games for Halloween and thought, hey, if I get 3 games for Halloween, I wonder how much I can get for Christmas. And so I got permission to do Christmas, and then I called every game company that I could think of pretty much. As things progressed, I got to a point where I was receiving about 1,500 games a year in the mail, most of them between the very end of August and maybe the beginning of October. I went for a trip once at that time. My family and I, we all went to Hawaii, which is where I'm from, in the early autumn, and my next door neighbor said he'd gather all my mail, so he took it all and brought it into his living room, having no idea how much that would turn out to be. When we came back, he had a little path through his living room.
Never again, I bet he said, yeah.
Yeah, he never made that offer again. And again, he was a great guy. He never opened a single one of those boxes.
So what was the kind of average week like for you then? Would you be setting days to playing and testing games and reviewing them, and then kind of getting new ones in, or how would you kind of go about it?
Well, I tried to publish an article a day. That averaged out because, like there were games that would take a long time, or stories that would take a long time. Then I'd go to E3 or a show in Japan and maybe publish 3 or 4 articles in a day. So it all depended. But, the average day was probably 4 to 6 hours of gaming, and then 2 or 3 hours of writing. And then when I started work on Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 1, which was really, truly 94, 95, I maintained that original schedule, plus I added to it as soon as my kids went to sleep. I'd write till maybe from 10 to 1 a.m. every night.
So you were really kind of living inside the industry. You must have had a great access to figures like Howard Lincoln and Tom Kalinske.
So for when I did the book Ultimate History of Video Games, the first volume, it was based on over 500 interviews. Everyone was so generous. The only people who said no, so Ken Kutaragi said no. He avoided me like the plague. Yamauchi over at Nintendo, I never got to interview him. It wasn't that he ever said no. He never said yes. I never got around to asking to interview him. I suspect the answer would have been no anyways. I don't think he spoke English, and I know he didn't have much time for the press. And then the Atari guys, Sam Tramiel, I had interviewed him several times before getting to work on the book. I offended him when he was struggling to keep the Jaguar alive at E3, I think it was 95, with Saturn just launched and PlayStation coming out later that year. And of course, we found out that Nintendo 64 wouldn't come out for another year. I was coming outside of the Atari booth, and a TV station cornered me and interviewed me and asked what I thought the results would be. And I said there'd be blood in the water. And they said, which systems do you think will go first? And I said I thought that the Jaguar would be the first to go, and then the 3DO. And then I had no idea about Saturn, PlayStation, or N64. I had a lot of belief that N64 would be great. I was always a big Nintendo fan. And I had a lot more faith in Sega back then than I did in Sony. Sony was the new kid on the block. Sam Tramiel happened to hear me doing that interview and never really spoke to me much again. I don't blame him a bit, frankly, on that. But the other thing I'll say that was kind of interesting about it was that if you watched, there was a TV show that came out called Console Wars based on on Blake's book of the same name. And at the very end of that documentary, they have a 2-second clip of me actually in that very interview outside the Atari booth saying, they didn't get as far as my prediction that the Jaguar would be first, but my prediction that there would be blood in the waters is right there in the console wars. It was funny to see myself.
Well, obviously you were right. I mean, the Jaguar 3DO, CDI, we had a lot of failed systems around that point in the of pre-PlayStation era.
But it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. And when you're the Tramiels struggling to keep Atari alive, you don't want to see somebody pouring gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, of course.
It was only a couple months later that Jaguar became a late night infomercial.
Well, were there any systems that you thought would be popular but weren't?
Oh, I'm always wrong on these things. To this day, I lament the failure of GameCube. I think GameCube may be the last real gaming system. It didn't play movies. It didn't cater to your grandparents. It was a gamer system. I love that controller. I still, people make fun of that controller. I think it was a wonderful controller. I agree, yeah. I think everything about GameCube was wonderful. Except a lot of the games. I think Mario Sunshine may be the worst Mario adventure game that ever came out. I think Nintendo sort of lost its way during the GameCube era. It's too bad.
Were you kind of having to pick sides with Sega and Nintendo? They were huge rivals, and you mentioned console wars there as well.
I didn't pick sides. I think everyone knew if I had to pick a side, it was Nintendo every time. Nintendo just made games I liked. And so the first time I met Tom Kalinske, he said something really nasty about Nintendo. I kind of said, they're not here. Don't pick on them. And he was nice about that. But what's interesting is Richard Bredvik Linder, who at the time was the head of Sega's communications, when I first started covering games and got invited to cover console games for the Seattle Times as well as arcade games, as well as computer games, I called Nintendo, said, hey, look, I'm covering video games for the Seattle Times. And they said, great. And the next thing I knew, I had a Game Boy, I had an NES, and I had a SNES sent to me in the mail, along with a bunch of games. I was like, here, get started. Anything you want, let us know. When I called Sega, they're like, well, can you prove that you're actually writing for the Seattle Times? So I sent them some articles. They said, okay, here's a loaner Genesis, and here are loaner games. We need you to mail them back to us. And then all of a sudden, Sega got really generous with me. And what it turned out was Richard Bredvik Linder, the head of the whole thing, said, hey, wait, he's in Nintendo's backyard. Wouldn't it be great if we could win him over and needle Nintendo in the Seattle Times? And so they went on a charm offensive, and they were pretty charming. But when it came to the games, Nintendo hit a low point in 94, 95. They had that Metroid game that was fabulous for the SNES. But they had a lot of really Me Too, not amazing stuff coming out. And their third parties weren't doing all that tremendous. Sega's strategy was, they created their own sort of studios in the United States. They had 70 Sega games coming out every year. Some were phenomenal, some were good. Not many of them were bad. And Nintendo's strategy was, let's just dig down tight and hold on till we get our next Miyamoto game.
Well, I remember when, the Mega Drive, as it was known over here, came out, and it just felt like a much cooler system than Nintendo, especially all their advertising and everything as well. But then, obviously, after that, Sega made their fair share of missteps in the mid-90s as well. I guess you were probably covering that at the time, when the Saturn came out and we had the 32X and that kind of thing. Did you think there was some missteps that Sega made there, and did the Saturn have more potential than was realized?
Well, once, they made huge mistakes with Saturn. Not just mistakes, but huge errors, colossal errors. First of all, Genesis, they had 19 million Genesis consoles in the United States. they had as I recall, a notable lead, not a huge lead, but a notable lead in Europe as well with the Mega Drive. In Japan, they were far behind. People would buy a Genesis when a new Sonic game would come out, and then they'd just sell it off, or a Mega Drive over there as well. So, they were in second place worldwide. They were in third place in Japan. Even TurboGrafx, back there, PC Engine was ahead of them. But the other thing is, so they have this advantage, and then out comes Saturn, and they shut down their Genesis business. They just turned their backs on 19 million users. And, I still remember going to E3 1995. That was in Atlanta. And they stood up and they announced that Saturn was already out. That was in May. Remember, Saturn was supposed to come out in September 1995. That was Sega Saturn Saturday, September 2nd, 1995. Well, they were really big into alliteration over at Sega. So they were supposed to come out in September. Everyone had written articles. I had written dozens of articles saying it's coming out in September. And then they announced, surprise, it's out already. We've shipped it this morning to Toys R Us and a few other places. And then I had a meeting with Mike Ribeiro, who had taken over at Sega. And I remember looking at him and saying, you kind of make us look stupid when you tell us September 2nd and all of a sudden you come out in May. And he said, well, if you read our releases carefully. And I interrupted him and said, hey, Mike, are you saying that I need to read your releases carefully from now on? Because if I have to read your releases carefully, look for hidden tricks, I may just stop reading them. Yeah, and his response to that was point taken. He understood that, but the thing is, they were desperate. They knew, they had to have known that Saturn was really, truly not meant to compete with PlayStation. Sony had infinite pockets. At the launch of PlayStation, Sony was a major corporation with real money, and Sega was hemorrhaging money in Japan, making money in the United States and Europe. But at the same time, when you stop to think about it, the original Master System was still alive in South America, particularly in Brazil. They had one or 2 years earlier launched 32X, which was a completely different system that you attached to your Genesis. They had Genesis. They had Pico, which was an amazing product for kids, but, they had two handhelds floating all at the same time. And they had Sega CD. And so, their attention was so split. And one of the ways they did it was by entirely turning their back on a very active, very excited Genesis market. And when they realized what a mistake that was, they tried to turn their attention back on them. But by that time, a lot of people had moved on.
The Seattle Times must have made you really kind of well known in the industry. And with all this stuff going on, do you have any specific events that you remember or shows that really changed stuff?
Well, the Seattle Times helped. Being in computer and electronic games helped too. But as it turns out, I got fired from my PR job the month before the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, which was also the month that Electronic Games was coming out. And so I would hide behind their booth at the Consumer Electronics Show and steal as many copies of the magazine as I could, and then rip out my article, my review. And then I had a little homemade business card that was printed on construction paper, of all things. And I walked around CES looking for editors and handing them my article from Electronic Games along with my little homemade business card, which got me in touch with Lance Elko, who was with a magazine called CD-ROM Today. And next thing I knew, Lance was using me a lot in CD-ROM Today. And I found another guy from Computer Life, and they used me a lot there. And the LA Times contacted me from the Seattle Times and asked me if I wanted a syndicated column, which of course I did. And so I sort of proliferated. But it was nice because I was the only one in Seattle. Everyone else was in the Bay Area, around San Francisco, where Sega and Sony would eventually start up, and Electronic Games was there, and LucasArts was there. So I had Nintendo and Microsoft, I won't say to myself, but I had good access to them.
Well, obviously, I mean, being well known in the industry and writing for all these respectable publications, I know you interviewed a lot of gaming legends during your career. Any memorable meetings?
Oh, tons and tons and tons of great meetings. I met with Shigeru Miyamoto 3 or 4 times a year. I met with Yuji Naka several times a year. Perrin Kaplan took me to a Chinese restaurant once. Perrin Kaplan was the head of communications for Nintendo America. Wonderful person again. We were in this Chinese restaurant, and they had never announced, Game Boy came out in 89. This must have been 94, maybe. And we're eating lunch together, and she pulls out a Game Boy Color, which had not even been announced yet, and shows it to me and says, "What do you think?" And of course, what could you think? I mean, here's a Game Boy, and it's playing some of your old games, and they're in color now. But the color was very washed out, but there was actually color in some of those old games. And what was memorable there was that the waitress came by and tried to buy it from her.
Oh, wow.
That was pretty fun. Maybe my most important interview, Sega knew that Charles Belfield and Peter Moore during the Dreamcast era knew that I was rooting for them, that I was very favorable press. They knew that I was also honest press, that I would, as much as I wanted them to succeed, I really wanted them well, at the time I was kind of angry with Sony, even though looking back, consider the PlayStation 2 to be one of the 2 most dominant, best game systems of all time, in their time period. At the time, early on, I wanted Dreamcast to win. I really did. And so Charles Belfield decided to throw me a bone if I was alert enough. So he called, and in an interview, he said, Dreamcast sales are down, so we've stopped production. And so I asked, when are you going to start production again? And he said, we're not sure. I said, you've discontinued Dreamcast. And that was how they announced that Dreamcast was discontinued.
Well, did you notice a big change in the industry when the PlayStation was released?
Huge, enormous. It was a sea change. So what nobody was noticing at the time of the console wars was that Nintendo had been a system for elementary school kids and true enthusiasts. And then Genesis came along, and Nintendo didn't see it, but now high schoolers were playing games. Sega effectively turned Nintendo into your little brother's toy. So Nintendo's sitting there wondering, how come nobody's buying? How come Genesis is outselling us? We've got a more powerful hardware. We're doing everything we've always done right. But they were playing into Sega's hands when they, they had commercials with people dancing around a giant SNES, and when they didn't include the fatalities in Mortal Kombat, they totally played into Sega's hands. But I think everyone thought, okay, well, now high schoolers are playing it, and that stops there. Sony realized that college students would love to play video games if they weren't about plumbers or blue hedgehogs. So now all of a sudden, there was a wall there that Sony destroyed. And the Sony name, when you saw Nintendo, you thought kids company. When you saw Sega, there was a cool factor to Sega, but it was still not everyone wanted. There was nothing cool about sitting around playing video games yet. And Sony brought that cool. Sony absolutely brought that cool because Sony wasn't a toy company. Sony was an electronics company. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of my memory of it as well. I think you're right. It was like, I remember, a lot of like 18, 19-year-olds, like the older teenagers getting into PlayStation. They're going out to bars and then coming back and playing PlayStation at after parties till, 5 o'clock in the morning and drinking and that
the
kind of
history
thing.
of Sony just being cool with like the Walkman and the Discman and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Jim Wims told me something that he was, one of those very short-lived heads of Sony Computer Entertainment America, where they went through Steve Race and then Jim Wim. Of course, Bernie Stoller was there as well. And then in came, they got rid of all of them, and in came Kaz Hirai. And he would, of course, remain there for a long time and eventually become the head of all Sony. But one thing that Jim Wims told me that was really brilliant was they brought in focus groups where they knew they had an even number of SNES owners and Genesis owners, Mega Drive owners, just for your audience. And what they found was the SNES owners really were happier, but they were embarrassed that they were SNES owners, to the point where some of them would deny that they had a SNES, even though the people doing the interview knew they had one. They'd say, okay, you have a Super Nintendo, don't you? And they're, no, not me. Not me. I don't own one of those. And the Genesis owners were not as happy with their consoles and their games as the SNES owners, but they were not embarrassed of their ownership. And so Sony looked at that and said, how do we get the best of both worlds? And they really did it. Yeah, I mean, the early days of PlayStation, they worked so hard to support third parties and to make it cool, but also make it fun.
Well, I know that Nintendo obviously tried to kind of realign their image with that. And obviously when the N64, or the Ultra 64 as it was originally called in the press, we were hearing loads of stories about how that was going to be, next level gaming. It's going to be like nothing you've ever seen before. And obviously it was delayed quite a bit. I mean, I guess obviously you were covering all this kind of stuff, the hype leading up to the N64. What did you kind of think of it?
Well, Nintendo did a little underhanded stuff around then too. When Cruisin' USA came out, they sort of hinted it was running on an Ultra 64. Yeah, the arcade game, and it most certainly was not. I really liked Minoru Arakawa. I really liked Howard Lincoln, and they would show me stuff, and what they would show me was pretty good. But N64, it had so few polygons and relied so much on texturing. John Carmack made a statement. He said it not just to me. He said it to lots and lots and lots of people. And it was a brilliant statement that with gaming, that people were always looking for elegant solutions. But in the end, it was just raw power that won every time. So the elegant solution was all kinds of different smarter pixels or this or that. But in the end, 2 years later, a new processor would come out, a new GPU, a new graphics card, and all those smart pixels just look prehistoric next to what you could do now that you had more polygons. Sony really capitalized on that. I thought that, to me, the majority of N64 games, not all N64 games, but a lot of them looked like they were inflated. Like the characters in them were inflated, inflated toys. And they didn't look that way on PlayStation.
Well, you wrote for some obviously huge gaming magazines that you've already mentioned, like, Electronic Games Next Gen as well. How did these magazines kind of handle the rise of the internet in the mid-90s? Because obviously that was a big changing point.
Yeah, it was. Next Gen was a privilege writing for Next Gen. I don't know if he'll ever hear this. My editor there was a guy named Neil West, who was about the most charming guy you could ever meet, and smart and just cool. He would do things that were pretty hilarious sometimes too. His assistant, his number 2 guy, was Chris Charlo, who's now at Microsoft and doing big things. And Next Gen was always more than anyone else. A lot of the magazines covered what was going on, But next gen with Neil and Chris and Tom Russo and the other guys really had a nose for what was coming, more so than I did. I think I've told this story a dozen times. It's always embarrassing, and I'll tell it again, just because we Americans love to humiliate ourselves, I guess. With Apple computers, this tells you what a great prophet of the future I am. When they announced iMac, I said it was going to fail because it didn't have a disk drive. And, how do you get stuff into your computer without a disk drive? And so I thought iMac was going to fail. And then they announced iPod. And I said, we've already seen Nomad and Bandit. The world has already looked at MP3 players. We're not interested. And then they talked about iPhone. And I said, there are no buttons on this thing. Why? No one wants a phone without any buttons. And then they said iPad. And I looked at it and said, it's just a big iPod. Who wants that? I was wrong every single time. And this isn't a little wrong. That's a lot wrong. So
a lot of people thought that, though, didn't they? You weren't alone.
Yeah, most of them were bright enough not to put it in USA Today or on MSNBC.
Did you attend any launches then? And were they also like any systems that came out and they hadn't really got going yet, and then once they did, you'd kind of change your opinion on them?
Well, I went to quite a few launches, including, I was at the biggest launch in history I was at, which is the Japanese launch of the PlayStation 2. I was there at every step. When they had their Glimpse of the Future event in Japan, where in that huge opera house, in the convention center, I was there. When I talk about that in the book, some of it's memory and some of it's talking to other people who were there to get their quotes. But I was there in that auditorium watching, Ken Kutaragi show things that absolutely blew everyone's mind. And then I got to I returned to Japan on my own dime to cover the actual launch. That was the biggest launch in history. I mean, the launch of the PlayStation 2 in Japan was, they held it on a Saturday because, they didn't want the whole city bogged down traffic-wise. It would turn all of Tokyo into a traffic jam. And it was early in the morning, and it was so interesting because late the night before, there were huge lines in front of every major store in Akihabara. And if a store was known to have some that hadn't been pre-purchased, then there were thousands of people in front of them. And none of those stores had more than a couple hundred of consoles to give out. I was one who had not bought one in advance, and I got in one of those lines. And this guy came out and he saw me and said, "You're American?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "When did you pre-purchase?" And I told him I hadn't. And he came back and he said, "Do not leave your space in line." And so, I thought, okay, that's really nice of you. But I left my space in line because it was getting to 3 or 4 in the morning and I was tired, and I knew by that time I knew I wasn't going to get a system. So I left my place in line and I went back to the hotel and I slept for a couple hours, and I came back an hour before the launch, and the guy came back out and said, "I told you not to leave your space in line." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to get one." And he handed me a ticket for one. I still had to pay for it, but I was able to get a console. A kid committed suicide that day. He climbed to the top of one of the stores that was selling them and jumped off 3 floors. People were mugged going home with their PlayStation 2s. That was a huge event. It was. I got stopped. I think maybe the guy from the news service didn't speak English or didn't speak Japanese, so he stopped me and said, "What do you think of the launch of the PlayStation 2?" And I told him that in gaming history, this is the launch of the Steam engine. Next thing I knew, when I came home, people were calling up and saying, "Hey, you're in Newsweek magazine." And, my response was, well, I didn't see N-Guy there. N-Guy Kroll was the guy who covered their video games. but they had a little section in the front of the magazine where they ran quotes, and there was that quote.
It really was a phenomenon, that system, absolutely.
You know, it's impossible to overestimate or overexpress how the PlayStation 2 and the NES, just what power those launches had. And it wasn't just power, it's that you'd go to the mall every weekend and you'd see something new and not unexpected on the Nintendo Entertainment System or the PlayStation 2. You had no idea it was coming, and it was great just the same.
Well, in 2001, you released what is often said to be the best book covering the creation and rise of the industry at that time. That was The Ultimate History of Video Games. So you mentioned that you started writing that, several years before. Where did the idea come from, and how did you start writing that book?
Well, the idea came from that, one, I was very full of myself because people everywhere, my magazines, my articles were appearing everywhere, places where I didn't even deserve to be. And I was really, truly, I'd become very arrogant. Around that time, while I was working on the book even, here we go, humiliating myself again, there was a point where I needed some art for a big article. And Eileen Tanner, who worked for the PR firm that worked for Nintendo, was in charge of helping me out with the art, and she didn't get it to me on time. I really gave her hell over it. I was off the rails. I was wrong. I really blew up. And I got a call a few minutes later that day from Perrin Kaplan, who, again, the head of communications for Nintendo. And Perrin said, we don't send product. And she listed a couple of very big national journalists, people who are in the mainstream much bigger than me, including the guy who, Gene Shalit, who was the NBC Today Show tech reviewer and movie reviewer. She said, we don't send product to him because he was rude to our PR person, and he's a lot bigger than you. And that put me in my place. I needed that. But I thought, I didn't know that the book Phoenix, The Fall and Rise of Games was out yet. I still would have written the book even if I had known that Phoenix was out, because Phoenix was more like an encyclopedia. It wasn't especially readable. It was just packed with good information. Mine was more of a narrative than Lenny Herman's, than Phoenix. But around 93, 94, I realized I'd been there. I didn't get a Pong. I got a Telstar instead, but I'd been there watching the games evolve and playing as everything I could get my hands on from the very beginning. And I thought, when I'd propose articles about history, my editors at Next Gen and Electronic Games and MSNBC liked my doing historical articles. So I thought, why not do a book? And it actually helped my career as well as putting together the book, because I'd find these people and I'd publish the articles, I'd make some money, which fed my family, and I'd gather information for my books, and I got a reputation for knowing game history all at the same time.
Well, it's interesting that you didn't just start on Pong as well. You went back to the pinball industry. Was it important to have that context?
Well, I went all the way back to Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
Because Lincoln played Bagatelle, and Bagatelle morphed, or at least in theory, Lincoln played Bagatelle, and that morphed into pinball, which created the mechanisms through which arcade games were sold, and many of the companies that made the big arcade games. And if you were going to do a history of mankind, where do you start? And by the way, I always bring this up, but I want to bring it up again. Naming that book The Ultimate History of Video Games was not my idea. This was coming out in the 90s. Video games had been around for 25 years, so I wanted to call it the first quarter. A nice little double entendre, playing on quarters in arcade games, which were still around at that time and big, and 25 years of video games. The full name was The First Quarter, a 25-year history of video games. But when Prima bought it from me, the editor who took over and later edited it for Crown Book, said, look, we can't call it the first quarter. People won't know whether it's about basketball, coin collecting, or financials. And they said, they suggested Ultimate History of Video Games. I said, absolutely not, because once you call something ultimate, you beg people to prove that it's not ultimate and that there's something more ultimate. And I wasn't that confident. I didn't want people doing that. But they went with Ultimate History of Video Games, and I think overall it was a good choice on there.
I know the book was very well received, and you did a lot of interviews for it as well. I mean, how many interviews did you do, and kind of which were your favorite interviews in the book?
I did over 500 interviews. You know, Nolan Bushnell was always a treat to interview. Al Alcorn was hilarious. Al actually was kind enough to take me on a tour of the important sites of the creation of video games in the San Jose area. I loved interviewing Miyamoto and Dave Toyer, the creator of Tempest. You know, the man changed my life. Tempest was and probably is still my favorite arcade game. Not my favorite arcade game to own because I really stink at it, but it was such a great game. And, you know, it was my favorite arcade game to spend $40 on per night type of thing, and never last more than a minute or two per quarter. It was such a great game. Did you guys play Tempest ever?
Yeah, and I'm exactly the same. I love it, but yeah, I'm terrible at it. I love the version on the Atari Jaguar, actually, you know, the Jeff Minter one, Tempest 2000. That's fantastic.
Brilliant work. Brilliant work. I only gave it a C, which I regret to this day. The reason I only gave it a C was because Atari had promised to support it with a wheel controller, and they'd never released the wheel controller, so I gave it a C in protest. But Jeff Minter deserved an A+ because he created the best game that ever came out on the Jaguar.
I think you're right that you need a rotary controller to play that game, really, don't you?
You do. It's not Tempest without.
I mean, the book was 590 pages. I mean, it was a big book. Was that the intention, or did it just kind of keep growing?
Well, yeah, I thought I was going to publish it in 96. I started looking for publishers in 96. So I thought it would end with the launch of the N64, but you know, the belief at the time was that nobody cares about video games and that video game players don't read books. I sent it to a bunch of publishers that turned me down and then released other books. One of them, Little Brown, turned me down and released another book very, very quickly thereafter. To this day, I think they got the idea from my proposal. I could be wrong, but those books were fine. They were okay. I'm not putting those books down, but nobody wanted a book on video games when I first started. Prima turned me down as well. They were doing strategy guides, so they certainly knew about books for gamers. And then my dad talked me into self-publishing on Amazon. And that was a great idea and a terrible idea. It was a great idea because I made $5,000 and for a brief week or two was the fastest selling self-published book in the history of Amazon. I sold my 5,000 out really quickly. It was a terrible idea because, as we discussed earlier, I'm dyslexic, and I think, Ravi, you and I can agree that dyslexics should not edit their own books.
No, not at all. Yeah, I can imagine putting something out and then having to get it redone over and over again. Yeah, and you can't with a book, terrible. Can you?
And if you look at the reviews, everybody, even the most generous people, the people who really want to like the book, say it's a great book but made hard to read by all the grammatical mistakes and a couple of historical mistakes too. Actually, a number of them. One of my problems is that I really, really like oral history. And the way people remember things isn't always the way they happened. I interviewed Al Alcorn and Steve Wozniak in that book. And then Walter Isaacson, a decade later, interviewed them for a book he was writing. And they tell some of the same stories I told, only they're quite a bit different in his book. And it isn't because they lied to me. I mean, maybe people read what they had said in my book and pointed out what they did wrong, or maybe I got it right in my book and they forgot things. But one way or another, the stories in the Isaacson book are different than my book. But
I think we get that with podcast guests as well. We always get a different angle or a different view of what happened, from each person's personal perspective.
Well, especially with 60-year-old podcast guests like myself, I'm afraid. But one of the examples I can give that is where Toru Iwatani was talking to me about making Pac-Man, and he talked about how they couldn't decide what Pac-Man should look like, and then they went to a pizza parlor, and somebody had taken the first piece of pizza, and when he reached down to take the second, there was Pac-Man staring at him. And that sounds great, except I found an article from the time that Pac-Man came out in which he said, I wish I could say that this is how it happened. So over
the story
time,
changed over time, yeah.
That had morphed.
Well, the first book ended just as the Xbox and GameCube were released. Obviously now, 20 years later, you've released The Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 2. So why was now the right time to do the follow-up?
Mostly because people were saying this isn't the ultimate history of video games. This is the ultimately outdated history of video games. And, the thing that's really interesting with this book is you would think that, I covered 150 years of history. I covered from Abraham Lincoln to GameCube in that first book. So 600 pages, 150 pages of history. At first I thought, we'll just add a couple of chapters to the original book and update it. And then as we looked at the project, we realized you couldn't do that because, one, it's 600 pages long. If we had another 100 or 200 pages, it's 700 pages long, and 700-page books tend to fall apart. And secondly, a lot had happened. So we thought, okay, we'll cover the 20 years in 600 pages. And then I just covered basically from the PlayStation 3 Wii era, the PlayStation 2 era, the PlayStation 2 GameCube era, and that took 300 pages. And we realized that we're not even going to get to the present. All this book covers is PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, Xbox, Xbox 360, GameCube, and Wii, with DS and PSP thrown in and a few things like that. But it stops in 2012. Well, the intention is to release another book in 2026 that will cover PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, etc. et al., and catch us up finally.
Tell us a bit about, obviously you said it goes up to 2012. So who features in this book then? And kind of tell us a bit about it.
It goes into 2012, except what I would do is, like I said, there's a rhythm. And the rhythm was I would talk about an era, a generation of home console. And then I'd have 2 or 3 chapters about things that sort of occurred in that era. And if they went on in history, I tried to cover them a bit. So, for instance, I have the first chapters. There's a chapter about PlayStation 2 really taking over. And then a chapter about the demise of Dreamcast called about Sega, a cautionary tale, I believe is the title. And then more chapters about just how they competed with each other. And then it goes into the afterlife of arcade games and a few other issues from the time. And then in the next section, I start with the launches of the new consoles. The last 2 chapters actually almost get up to the present. The last 2 chapters of the book are about really the rivalry between Activision and Electronic Arts for the competing to be the largest company in games, and a lot of the dumb things they've done at both companies. And then the final chapter is about the very dysfunctional relationship between Hollywood and Silicon Valley, and how games based on movies are generally bad, and movies based on games are generally worse.
Well, obviously, Steve, you've been front row checking out all this stuff, for the last 30 years. So I think, you're absolutely the perfect person to write these books. And obviously they are available now, Volume 1 and Volume 2 on Amazon, which I'll link up in our show notes. Everyone should go and check them out and buy them. Just one final question. Obviously, having such a long history in video games, what do you think was the most exciting time in gaming, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on. You guys have been wonderful, gracious hosts, and I appreciate that. But also, just you guys, thank you for having me on. I want to make sure that you and your audience know I'm very grateful. Did you guys ever have Mad magazine in the UK?
We didn't have
No.
Mad. We had like British equivalents, but we do know a lot about Mad because there's a kind of big connection with video games and like, you know, Spy vs. Spy and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Spy versus Spy was a Mad, very much a Mad thing, you know, a Mad magazine. So my point being that if you asked people back when Mad was around, when was the heyday, they generally told you it was at the time that they were in junior high school. And if you ask people when was the heyday of Saturday Night Live, usually they'll tell you it's about the time that they were in college. You know, some people think it was the Eddie Murphy period, which I kind of agree with. Lo and behold, that's when I was in college. Some people think it's now, and most of those people are younger and just out of college. And I think that there's a lot of that with video games too. That there's a period where things are new to you and exciting, and you don't see that they were done, only not quite as well in earlier generations. For me, it's like a time machine. If I could go back into an old arcade and play She's Got Betty Davis Eyes or Video Killed the Radio Star, you know, if I hear those playing in the background and being in a dark arcade where the only light around is the logo glow coming from the screens, just the thought of it gets my pulse pumping. So for me, if I had to say the most exciting time, it was the arcade revolution of 81, 82. But really, I didn't notice when the arcade business went down. You know, 82, 83 was a great time to be a gamer. It's just some of the big arcades were disappearing. That was my time.
That sounds incredible, Steve. And obviously, I mean, it's an industry that's constantly changing. And if people want to check out, you know, the last 40 years and beyond of where gaming's come from, absolutely check out The Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 1 and 2. Like I mentioned, I'll put that in our show notes. Steve, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your stories with us.
Thank you for having me on.